Here's today's reminder. If your church is going to grow, you have to equip your leaders. But how do you do this? How do you empower the leaders at your church to lead well? Join us at equiplab.com/churchleaders. We're here to equip your ministry team to thrive. Just go to equiplab.com/churchleaders and join us today.
Welcome to the Church Leaders Podcast. I'm your host, Jason Day, and in this 4-part series, we'll explore how the church can pursue true racial reconciliation. Now, race is a conversation that is often fraught with difficulty. Even where we recognize trends in what different communities believe, people are complex and have differing perspectives within those communities. Nevertheless, as Christ followers, we believe that Jesus is the ultimate source of truth, justice, and redemption. Working from that foundation, we're inviting trusted ministry leaders into conversation with us so that we can listen to and learn from them on this important subject. Some of the questions we explore are, how can believers pursue gospel-centered racial reconciliation, and what gets in the way of that pursuit? And what are the practical steps church leaders can take to address racial divides? While a podcast series can only begin to scratch the surface of this complex topic, we hope you'll find our series to be thought-provoking, encouraging, and informative. And now, on to this week's special guest.
Welcome to the Church Leaders Podcast, conversations with today's top ministry leaders to help you lead better every day. And now podcasting from scenic Colorado Springs, Colorado, here's your host, Jason Day.
Raymond Chang is a pastor, writer, and the president and co-founder of the Asian American Christian Collaborative. He regularly preaches God's Word and speaks throughout the country on issues pertaining to Christianity and culture, race, and faith. He has lived throughout the world and currently lives in Chicagoland, where he serves as a campus minister at Wheaton College. In this episode, Ray and I discuss racism from the Asian American perspective. Ray highlights the different types of racism often experienced by Asian Americans and shares thoughts on justice fatigue and the opportunities and responsibilities of the local church. It's such an insightful conversation. You'll want to share it with your ministry leaders and your colleagues. So now let's dive into my conversation with Raymond Chang. Ray, welcome to the Church Leaders Podcast. Thank you for joining us today.
Oh, thanks for having me, Jason.
Now, Ray, you've lived in a number of countries. You've been involved in a variety of roles, a variety of projects. Can you just start off by just telling us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so my name is Raymond Chang, and I serve as the president of the Asian American Christian Collaborative, which is an organization that's by, for, and about Asian American Christians to really promote a whole life discipleship and help people understand Asian American identity, Asian American Christian identity, and then to understand the experiences of Asian Americans more broadly. I also serve as a campus pastor at Wheaton College in Illinois, and so I get to kind of lead our discipleship efforts there, overseeing our small group ministries, I preaching in chapel, and then, of course, having pastoral conversations. And then born and raised in the Chicagoland, lived all over the world. I have, traveled to almost or maybe even over 50 countries by now. And then both in and out of vocational ministry. I worked in a nonprofit, worked in for-profit, and then currently now I'm in Christian higher education.
Yeah, that's excellent, Ray. And I love to see how God takes us on journeys, gives us different experiences, and puts us in different roles, but always seems like, obviously, he knows what he's doing for every season of our life and how he takes our experiences and really enrich every new season, right? And so here you are, as you said, in higher education, there at Wheaton, campus pastor, and the opportunities you have there. I imagine that the things that you have seen around the world, different cultures and the different roles that you've played, have a unique way of informing your work on a college campus, a Christian college campus. I would like to ask you, you started, as you mentioned, the Asian American Christian Collaborative. So could you tell us, you described a bit about it, but could you tell us why did you start this particular organization?
Yeah, great question. So I think for years, people have been asking if I'd be interested in starting something for Asian Americans, or saying something specific about, like, why is there no space for Asian American Christians to really gather, tell our stories, to really kind of be heard and be seen and be known. And over time, because of the ways that Asian Americans are racialized, which is primarily to either be invisible or excluded, we're oftentimes invisible in plain sight. And so I kind of kicked it down. I kicked the can down the road and saying, it'd be hard to start something for Asian American Christians now, mostly because it'd be difficult to gain the type of traction that we need to make a kind of a broader and widespread impact. Well, fast forward to the pandemic, and then the rising rhetoric around the coronavirus being called Kung flu, China flu, China virus, and then that rhetoric trickling down from the mouths of kind of our nation's leaders into the mouths of the people in the pews, and the leaders in the pulpits of our churches, and so one of the things that we saw is that the same attitudes, xenophobic or anti-Asian attitudes that we started seeing more broadly in society, started to emerge within our congregations, and congregations where Asian Americans were present, and in congregations where Asian Americans weren't present. And so a few of us started talking about kind of the rising concerns and the violence against Asian Americans. This was about March in 2020. And we wanted to try to get ahead of the curve and say, if there's a way that the church could lead to combat, anti-Asian hate, anti-Asian violence, maybe this is, that's something that we can do to kind of support the community. And so we drafted a statement and then released it. That got, in the first month, over 10,000 signatures. And we heard pastors from small churches to large churches to actually take the language that we use and share it from their pulpits. And we were really encouraged by that. And we got a broad kind of endorsement and a broad coalition of people from kind of a variety of from the entire basically theological spectrum of kind of Western Christianity, and we thought this might be the time to start something. And so we started an organization, and since then we have been trying to find ways to increase awareness about Asian American issues broadly, help people navigate Asian American Christian identity, and then help kind of the broader church and the broader society see the kind of see the people that are in their midst, like Asian Americans and Asian American Christians, and to allow our contributions to be offered to the broader kind of community. And so one of the things I've been really grateful for is, in addition to being able to partner with others, including African American leaders and pastors, and then Latino leaders and pastors, and indigenous leaders and pastors, and white leaders and pastors, not only are we kind of helping elevate an awareness around Asian American issues and Asian American Christian issues and Asian American Christian identity, but also to help build bridges and to reconcile the divides that race and racialization has caused and created. And then in addition to that, be a kind of a light to the world. And so I've been really kind of surprised and encouraged by the fact that non-Christians have been reaching out to us for insight and wisdom on a variety of issues, including local and national kind of leaders from a variety of governments throughout the United States, as well as Fortune kind of 500 companies reaching out to our team for insight. And so what's mostly surprising to me is that we have Christian in our name, so the Asian American Christian Collaborative. And there are other organizations that are doing good work from a non-Christian perspective. But for me, I'm like encouraged that, that people would reach out to us knowing that we are Christians, that they're seeing our word and our deed, that they're seeing our commitment to Christ, and are still willing to invite us in. And that's something that you don't often see in this world anymore, because Christians are oftentimes viewed as being on the wrong side of things, or kind of being on the bigoted side of things. And so we're trying to change that narrative for the sake of the gospel, for the sake of Christian witness, and we've been encouraged by that.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, I certainly appreciate what you're doing especially that idea, like you said, of having the opportunity to be a light, not only within the church and to provide some encouragement and some direction and some opportunities for people to think through things, right? But also outside of the church. And like you said, I just pray that we see more of that happening because we have the opportunity to influence culture. And in some ways, as you said, we've been sidelined to a degree. People are relatively dismissive in many arenas. They're dismissive of a Christian voice about anything. So that's awesome to hear. Now, there's a lot obviously that you have going on. So I want to back up a little bit to talk a little more about that statement that you guys released on Asian American racism.
Yeah.
And when you released that statement, you said that you received good response. You had over 10,000 people, sign off to, in kind of agreement with the statement, right? What has the ongoing kind of response been as you've come out of that? Did you see that as a something that obviously was valuable and important to address, but has that continued? Has there been continued conversation around that, or was that something that was like in the heat of the pandemic? It was something, and now we've moved beyond it. What are you sensing, and what are the responses?
Yeah. So, unfortunately, the violence and hate against Asians only increased over time, and our hope is that we might have curbed some of the violence through the work that we're doing, and other organizations would have curbed some of the violence that through the work that they were doing, whether they're Christian or not, because whether you're Christian or not, you should be standing against all forms of hate, right? All forms of racism. Like that's just. I think we just kind of, like all understand that racism is just a dirty way of labeling and objectifying people in ways that categorizes them as superior or inferior. When we wrote the statement, there were just over 1,000 kind of reports of anti-Asian hate. I think as of as of March of 2021, there were over 6,600. We saw a kind of a ramping up of like more harsh violence and more kind of significant violence to the point where multiple people were killed. And then, of course, we saw in March, March and April, like the rise of the Atlanta shootings that took place, where
Right.
8 people were killed, and 6 of whom were Asian women, and that was really like an awakening moment for, I think, the Asian Americans who were kind of on the sidelines, wondering um, if the violence was, as significant as it seemed to be. It was almost like this kind of collective national awareness and awakening that I think just kind of took over all the Asian American communities that I've been in contact with, where especially if you're an Asian American woman, you saw a lot of the logics that the shooter, who was a Christian, right, who's raised in a church, and the ways that he was thinking about temptation and sexual temptation and lust, how they have experienced echoes of that in their own lives. And so Asian American women all throughout the country felt this deeply within their bones. And Asian Americans broadly felt it similarly too. I mean, to the point where I think I cried, I don't know, 4 or 5 times in that week. And I hadn't bawled like that in so long. And the only word I could use was that everyone was reeling. Everyone's
Right.
reeling. And so the violence had increased, and we're still seeing lots of violence take place now. As with any type of issue surrounding justice, people just get tired of it, especially if they're not. People get tired of talking about it, especially if they're not the recipients of injustice, right? And so I think that's an area of concern that I have, is that this whole idea of justice fatigue starts settling in. And one of the things I remind Christians is that like if you have justice fatigue, you're also experiencing a Jesus fatigue, because Jesus was the embodiment of perfect justice, and through his cross you saw the ultimate act of justice take place. And so um, don't get fatigued by justice, especially if the justice doesn't impact you. Um, press into it more, and find ways to sustain the conversation, sustain the efforts to combat it. But sadly, we've only seen the anti-Asian racism increase, the anti-Asian violence increase, and I think one of the things that we need to do is continue to work to address it. Fortunately, we've seen more efforts to talk about it and to combat it, and so there's also that as well.
Yeah, yeah, I would say that's definitely, the awareness has been raised, I think, to a great degree, and unfortunately, some of the awareness was raised, as you said, with the Atlanta shooting and those types of things. I do want to touch on that tragedy quickly, because you'd mentioned, the person who did the shooting, perpetrated that crime, murdered those women, was claimed to be a Christian, claimed to be part of a church, and that was part of the obviously wrestling. When an event like that happens, regardless if it's against the Asian American community or just generally, a tragedy like that happens, as a pastor, as a ministry leader yourself, whenever there's a tie like that to the church, because that's something that obviously comes out on the media, and it's just it's a challenge for we're talking to pastors of local churches and ministry leaders who are listening in right now. Ray, what recommendation would you have when a tragedy like that occurs? How do we as the church best respond to those types of tragedies?
Yeah, so I think to Christian leaders and people who shepherd their flock, you have a different role than maybe the average congregant does, right? Because they're looking to you for care. They're looking to you for guidance and protection, even. Not just theological protection, but like a true like spiritual protection, which is an embodied protection. It's one that doesn't just care for their souls; it cares for the whole of their beings. And so I think there's two types of kind of communities that we can talk to. One is the average congregant, and then one is to the leader. But we'll focus more on the leader here. I think for the leader, uh, reaching out immediately is helpful, and then creating space that people can either enter into, or giving options for you to kind of offer yourself as a person who's available, so that if they want you to enter into their space, whether it's the emotional space, a mental space, or even like a physical space in the same room, that's important to do. I think the ministry of availability is significant, right? And so making yourself available, either by saying, okay, like from 5 o'clock p.m. to 10 p.m. tomorrow, I will be available. Stop by the church office, and then please, I'd be happy to sit with you. We'll provide you with a meal. We'll pray together. Let's just grieve together. Let's lament together. Let's call out to God together. I think there's a comfort in that. I think there's also comfort in convening a group together. So not just providing individual pastoral care, but convening a space where, or opening up a space where multiple people can gather, so that they can kind of share and process and grieve with one another. And you are there to kind of pray alongside them, to listen, not necessarily dominate the conversation, but to provide some words of comfort where it's appropriate. I don't think that that's done enough, right? Like one of the things that, especially working with college students, is that they almost want an immediate response. They want a thoughtful response. And they understand if the situations are so complicated that it takes some time to craft like a very deep and robust and nuanced response when the circumstances are challenging. But they want some form of acknowledgement, because the way that racial trauma works, or racial pain works, is that it's not an individual thing. It's not just like me experiencing racism. It's not just me, like someone using racial slurs against me. It's me having experienced some of that, but also seeing that the things that happen outside of like my own life or my own community can easily happen to me. And then knowing that there are family members or friends of mine that have shared experiences, seeing how much it's grieving them, it does start weighing on your own kind of soul, and it starts kind of adding pressure and weight onto your own physical body. And um, so knowing that what happens out there actually impacts the person or the people within your care is a really important thing to understand, that I don't know if enough people understand it, right? I think that when we hear about the persecution of Christians, right, as Christians here in the United States, there is a part of us that just that just our hearts go out to them, our souls react, and we understand deeply how that impacts us. Because like I grieve whenever I hear that Christians are persecuted around the world. So the same thing happens along racial lines, right? That same sort of like collective pain transfers over to the people within your pews and in your congregations. And so knowing that people are oftentimes looking for, at the very minimum, a pastoral prayer. And that's the lowest hanging fruit. Like that doesn't even require that much effort. Like it costs you nothing to do that. But if you want to be thoughtful and actually go forward, I mean, don't just pray for the people that were victimized or hurt in the process, um, but also give people a better vision from what the scriptures are saying, and call people out of kind of these views where we are complacent or apathetic towards racist events that take place all over the world.
Yeah, that's incredibly helpful, and I love the that you talked about, drawing that connection between how we might think of persecuted Christ followers around the world, because I think that really brings it home, especially to those like me who aren't necessarily in a minority group, right? So to kind of think through that, that pain and that heaviness that we sense and feel when brothers and sisters around the world are experiencing that, helps drive it home, I think, for so many people, because it's a bigger, like you said, it's not just something happening to me. And oftentimes when it's not happening to me, it's happening to someone else, I can just think of it as, oh, something happening to them, or something happening, or even you see a news story, oh, that's something that person experienced. But to think of kind of the collective burden and heaviness, I think, is very helpful, Ray. So thank you for that. One of the things you mentioned earlier that I'd like to touch on is you mentioned that a lot of the racism against Asian Americans relates to a sense of invisibility or exclusion. And I think this is a really interesting piece of this conversation, because you have that, but what, as we've just been discussing, has been bubbling up in the news is the racism that we're kind of probably most accustomed to, and that is violence against someone of another race, or some sort of external, outward attack or whatever against someone. That's oftentimes when we think of racism, we're thinking of that. And yet, as you've shared, that a lot of racism in the Asian American community is this, is not necessarily, a big external violent or whatever. It's more of this invisibility. It's more of this something that people don't recognize as readily as they might recognize other acts of racism. So can you talk a little bit about, and kind of help us understand, what you mean by that sense of invisibility, and how that impacts, Asian Americans?
Yeah, I do want to say, I think that it's important to first let people know who are listening, and that the term Asian American is not a perfect term, right? It's a really complex term, because you're talking about dozens of nationalities, dozens of ethnicities, dozens of languages, all represented within kind of the term Asia, and then transported into the American experience. It's like the Asian American identity is not a monolithic identity. It spans languages, cultures, ethnicities, experiences, histories of immigration, histories of navigating kind of American life, right? And so like there's a very different experience if you come to the United States as a refugee versus an immigrant here for, for business reasons or for study, and all those things kind of shape your experience in navigating in navigating kind of like this landscape. The other piece I want to highlight is that the violence against Asian Americans is not new. Historically, Asian Americans have experienced significant violence. I mean, from one of the largest lynchings in the history of the United States in the late 1800s to take place against Chinese people, where a tenth of Los Angeles descended on a tenth of the Chinese population and then lynched them. 17 to 20 people were killed. And that was when Los Angeles was a tiny kind of population. In Chinatown, like you've seen that there's been a significant amount of violence that takes place against Asians. Vincent Chin in 1982, he was minding his own business at his own bachelor parties, celebrating what would be a happy day, upcoming marriage, and because it was at the kind of the peak of the downturn where for American auto of the American auto industry. Vincent, who was Chinese, was kind of perceived to be Japanese, and there was this massive anti-Japanese sentiment that took over. And these two white auto workers looked at him, started taunting him, started calling him Japanese slurs, and then eventually bludgeoned him to death outside of the establishment. And then I think he died a few days later. And so violence against Asians is not new. Even throughout the pandemic, we've been seeing, people getting slashed with a box cutter. People are elderly getting shoved. Elderly women getting drop kicked at bus stops. Someone getting kicked down and then stomped in the head. Someone shortly after Atlanta, a friend of mine is a pastor in New York, and he said that there was a congregant who was walking through Central Park in New York, and this man walked up behind her and basically said, "Why don't you give me a massage?" And then her husband was not too far, and so he also Asian, and stood up to this man and said, "You need to stop it. Like this is racist and this is wrong." And then he got attacked and he ended up in the hospital, right, for defending his wife. And so, like, even after something like Atlanta, you would think that people would be more sensitive towards Asian Americans, not equating them with sex workers. And the majority of the victims in Atlanta were like middle-aged, elderly women. And so, like, to even make that connection it follows a deeply and a long-rooted history of Asian stereotypes and anti-Asian racism, where women were oftentimes perceived to be kind of a part of the sex industry and seductive and all this other stuff that led to their objectification and fetishization. We've seen a ton of violence, against Asian Americans. I mean, children, a family was stabbed. A Burmese family was stabbed outside of I think it was a Walmart or a Target. And then because they were perceived to be Chinese, and the kids were under 6 years old, two of them, right? A 2 and a 5-year-old, I believe, were stabbed. And so we have a host of kind of anti-Asian hate that takes place. And it happened even before the pandemic, right? And so, like, when I was living in Koreatown in Los Angeles, there were several instances of our elderly kind of grandmothers getting shoved to the ground. And when you're 80, 90 years old and you get shoved to the ground, you can't recover in the same way. Your bones are going to break. You're gonna get wounded in ways that, if you just scrape your knee as like a 3-year-old or a 5-year-old, it heals rather quickly. It doesn't happen the same way if you're elderly. And so, this is not new. It's more new for a lot of people that are looking into our communities. But those of us who are on the ground have been kind of close to those who are more in the margins of our own communities know that this is not uncommon. But the whole piece about the invisibility and exclusion, I think, are pretty consistent themes throughout Asian American history, and the ways in which we have been racialized and that racism works against us. The model minority myth contributes to us being invisible in plain sight, which is why there's something called the bamboo ceiling, that that we're good at the best middle managers. We put our head down, we keep quiet, we don't rock the boat, we work hard, and all of that you can trace back to someone with the last name Peterson's article that identified like biological traits and said that Asians are like these great minorities because of their biology, and he said that there's something in our genes, and that's why they're so good. And so if you've ever heard someone say, oh, you're so good at math, or you're so good at science, or like all Asians are smart, or all Asians are this X, Y, and Z, and it's a positive stereotype, it's actually it puts us in like it typecasts us into these narrow lanes that we feel pressure to live up to, but also feel like we can't break out of. Like, let's say, for example, if we're an artist or whatnot. The other piece is it becomes very difficult for our community to experience, like, to seek out mental health, and so there's a lot of shame in seeking out mental health because these expectations are compounded upon our communities, and so even in the pandemic, Asian Americans had the greatest mental health needs of all the racial groups, and it becomes really difficult to encourage people to actually go and seek help when they need the help. But the model minority myth is ultimately problematic, not necessarily because it only keeps us in these like racialized cages that says that we have to perform and perform and perform in order to be accepted, and then do it without complaining, even if we face injustice. But it's oftentimes used and it's primarily actually used as a way to push other communities of color down, right? So other racialized minority communities down. So it gives you the impression and the perception that that we're being celebrated, but it doesn't actually lift us up. It actually pushes other communities down. So it pushes those who are racialized as Black and brown down by saying you need to be like Asians, who basically don't rock the boat, who accept their station in life, that don't complain about things, and are willing to maintain the status quo. And that's not okay when you live in a racialized society that's in contradiction to the kingdom of God as a Christian, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so there's the invisibility piece, that we're kind of invisible in plain sight. The other piece is the exclusion piece, which is kind of the byproduct of the perpetual foreigner stereotype, or the perpetual foreigner syndrome, which essentially says that no matter how many generations we're here in the United States, we're never American enough, right? So I know Asian Americans that have been here for 7 generations. Their families have been here for 7 generations, and they still get treated as if they are not American, that they are foreigners, that they just they were fresh off the boat.
Right.
They just landed here just yesterday. And so they're asked, well, how do you speak English so well? Or, where are you from? And then when they say, I'm from San Francisco or New York or Chicago or LA or whatever, they say, no, where are you really from? And all of those things kind of play into our feelings of not belonging and feelings of exclusion.
Yeah, it's interesting as we kind of talk through that, and as you share that, because we can see there are many different ways that racism can be perpetrated and encouraged, even when people aren't necessarily recognizing it as racism, which I think is very, very important. That's why I think a lot of these conversations are so important to be having right now. And I would like, Ray, if we could talk a little bit about, for the church leaders, for pastors, what do you believe is the path forward here in the U.S. And in the church to achieve true racial reconciliation? What maybe have you seen that's encouraging, or thoughts or ideas that you have that we can really lean into this? And as you've said early in the beginning of this conversation, what you're hoping with the AACC is that you can help lead and guide the country at large, in these directions. So what can we as the church be doing now?
Yeah, tongue in cheek, I want to say, just be like Jesus.
Right.
Like Jesus, we would, and it's not actually tongue in cheek. I mean, if we embodied his humility and his self-sacrifice and his willingness to cross boundaries and borders and enter into spaces where the unwanted other resided, to give up power, to actually live into the kenosis of Christ, right? He who had all things, who had all power, gave it all up so that he could dwell with us, right, and be with us, um, and then ultimately atone for all of our sins and be resurrected so that he can, you know, establish a new kingdom. If there was even that, like a basic humility, a willingness to care for the one instead of protecting the interests of the comfortable 99, um, I wonder what that would look like. And so there's that piece. I also think that organizational culture, church culture, there's challenges to navigating those things, right? Because people become entrenched, and like oftentimes, people don't necessarily leave church because of theological differences. Because they generally leave church because of cultural and relational differences, right? They leave church because it doesn't suit their liturgical desires, or it doesn't suit their worship style, or it doesn't suit their preaching, X, Y, and Z. I do wonder what it would look like if church leaders did one of two things. And this is what I generally do when I'm asked to kind of speak at different churches and then kind of like consult with them or talk with organizations. I say, when was the last time you guys actually talked to the people who quietly left, didn't want anything to do with your church, that slipped out the back door because even if they've been here for 10, 15 years, when was the last time you talked to those people and asked them why they actually left? Especially if you start seeing patterns that, oh, it seems like this type of person doesn't want to stay, whether they're a racialized minority, or they're a female, or whatever, they don't want to stay. Like, what is it about them that led them to leave, and then what is it about your church that led them to leave? Because there's oftentimes a lot there that can help us to reflect and to change what needs to change, so that we really become a gospel community that doesn't seem more like a country club, but that actually serves as a field hospital. So that's one piece I would say. And then the second piece I would say is reach out to people that are from historically marginalized communities and say, what hinders you from fully entering into community here and fully flourishing in this community, and then fully being able to worship with us? Because one of the things I'm seeing more and more of in the research that I'm doing is that the environment, the racial environment, impacts the spiritual growth. And so, a lot of churches, especially if they're predominantly white or even multi-ethnic with white leadership, where the majority of the leaders are white and the majority of the pastors are white, is that there is a kind of cultural center to that alienates other racial groups, and shifting that cultural center is going to be really important as you try to embody the kingdom here in your local congregation context. Especially if you care about the flourishing of all and the spiritual vitality of all your members, right? I've never seen anyone, like, Jesus would not say, oh, they're not, like, yeah, they believe in me, but they're not a good fit here. That's the whole conversation of fit doesn't really work within the kingdom of God. The kingdom is far more expansive than a narrow cultural expression, a narrow kind of racial commitment.
Yeah, that's important, I think, to think from a kingdom perspective, because oftentimes what happens is we, and it kind of is what it is. We're week in and week out, leading a congregation, ministering, those types of things. And that gets shaped to some degree by the community that we find ourselves in, by the people that are around us, by the voices that we're listening to. And oftentimes that shaping isn't the kingdom, right? It's just being shaped by these other influences. So I think it's so important, Ray, as you said, to allow that kind of the kingdom values to be that which is shaping, and to step back and to as you said, even ask people questions who have left our ministry, our local congregations, or and to step back and take that time to assess and process a little bit, which I know we're all busy, but we need to take those times and carve out those times where we can process and assess, have some of those deeper conversations, and try to determine what is shaping us, what is influencing us. And if we're off course, if it isn't Jesus, like you said, living like Jesus, being like Jesus, if it isn't the kingdom, then what are things that we can practically do to recalibrate so we're in step with Christ, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think the more we are able to take a step back and really like practicing Sabbath, like worship in your rest, knowing that, like you're a finite person, that you can only get so much done, but there are broader systemic and structural realities and cultural realities that you still have to contend with as a pastor. You can't, they're bringing all the stuff that they're experiencing in the world into your church.
Yeah.
If you have no answer for them, which is what a lot of my students are saying, like our churches seem to have zero answers for all the societal divides that we're seeing, then they're going to look elsewhere for those answers. And though that elsewhere is usually not necessarily Christian, right?
Right.
Because the world is actually offering a more compelling vision than kind of the neglectful pastor who just thinks that if you just preach the gospel, everything is going to be okay. Yeah, preach the gospel, but apply the expansive kingdom and its principles into the whole world. Don't just assume that, that the world doesn't shape us or make us ask questions that are different than what you experienced growing up and things like that.
Yeah, it's so good. That's so good, Ray. Awesome, brother. Well, it's been so good to talk with you, to hear your heart, and you provide a lot of great insights. If our listeners would like to connect with you, or connect with your ministry more, what's the best way they can do that, Ray?
Yeah, if you want to follow me on social media, my Twitter handle is @TweetRayChang, TweetRayChang. My Instagram handle, I think, is RayChang502. And then our website is AsianAmericanChristianCollaborative.com or AAChristCollab.com. And then our social media handles, we're on Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn as AA Christ Collab, ChristCollab. And then on Facebook as well, Asian American Christian Collaborative. And If you want to shoot me an email, you can shoot me an email at Raymond@AAChristCollab.
That's awesome. And we will have those links for our listeners in our show notes, so you can find all of that and follow up with Ray, learn more about the ministry, the organization, all the things that he and his colleagues are doing. So thank you again for making the time to be with us, Ray. We certainly appreciate it.
Thank you, Jason. It was good to hang out.
Yeah, definitely. God bless you, brother.
God bless you too.
Thank you for joining me for this episode of the Church Leaders Podcast. Be sure to check out the other episodes in this series. You don't want to miss out on the full discussion. Also, don't forget to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss any of our interviews. We'd appreciate it if you could take just a few moments to let us know your thoughts by leaving us a review on your preferred podcast platform or sending an email to podcast@ChurchLeaders.com. Your positive reviews and ratings help other ministry leaders find us and benefit from our content. So until next time, this is Jason Day, encouraging you to love well and lead well.
You've been listening to the Church Leaders Podcast. For articles, videos, and free resources that will help you lead better every day, visit our website at ChurchLeaders.com. Thanks for